Let's go ahead and get started. Once again, I'm Rose. I'm with the National Farmworker Ministry. We're really glad that you have joined us for What You Can Do to Support Farm Workers webinar. Our co-presenters are Jeannie Economos. She's the coordinator of pesticide safety and environmental health protection at the Farmworker Association of Florida. Jeannie has worked for over 20 years on issues of the environment, environmental justice, Indigenous and immigrant rights, labor, peace, and social justice. She has held her position with the Farmworker Association since 2007, which includes annually training over 500 farm workers in Florida on their rights and protections in the workplace and how to protect themselves and their families from pesticide exposure. She is also engaged in local, state, national, and international coalitions and collaborations related to farm worker rights and health and safety, pesticide reduction, sustainable agriculture, and food sovereignty. So we're very happy to have Jeannie on this webinar with us. The other co-presenter is Julie Taylor. She is the Executive Director of National Farmworker Ministry. Originally from Alabama, Julie has spent time working with churches and church-related ministries, including more than 10 years of child advocacy work with church-related ministries. Julie came to the National Farmworker Ministry in 2015 as the executive director, but really she came in 2000 when she was sent to her first board meeting as a representative of United Methodist Women. And Julie brings a growing passion for advocacy for and with farm workers. At the end of this presentation, we will have a short time for question and answers. But meanwhile, during the presentation, please feel free to write any questions you might have in the chat box, and then we will answer as many as we can during the designated question period. This webinar is being recorded and will be used by National Farmworker Ministry or the Farmworker Association of Florida as needed. If you don't want to appear on the screen, please feel free to turn your camera off. All right, let's go ahead and get started. We have a lot to learn.
Thanks, Rose, and hello, friends. So glad that you're all here with Jeannie and I to talk about what we can do to support farm workers. Welcome to this event during Farm Worker Awareness Week. We want to get started by talking a little bit about just some basics related to farm workers. Some of you know this, some don't, but there are approximately 1.5 to 2 million farm workers in the US and an estimated 2 million minor children of farm worker families. Most of these farm workers are Hispanic, more than half are undocumented, around a third are women, and many do not speak English. Farm workers are located throughout the country, but the highest numbers are in California, Florida, North Carolina, Michigan, Washington, and Oregon. Most of the farm workers that I should qualify that by saying most of the farm workers that literally pick your fruits and vegetables that go to the grocery stores. Jeannie, tell us a little bit more.
Well, farm workers have been invisible for decades and generations. They've often been called the invisible people. But one thing that came out of the COVID pandemic was that for the first time in generations, farm workers were finally recognized and noticed as being essential workers. The reality is they've been essential ever since the days of enslaved labor on plantations in the Southeast. It's just that finally under COVID, they got the recognition that they deserve, although they did not get the protections that they deserved under COVID. Farm workers themselves, even though they harvest the food that feeds the rest of us, are often food insecure themselves. They have some of the lowest wages of any occupation. They face discrimination because of race. In Florida, our farm worker population are largely Hispanic from Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Mexico, but also we have farm workers from Haiti, and we still have some African-American farm workers. They face intimidation often because of their race or because of their document or their immigration status. They're exposed to toxic pesticides, and They are victims of a policy of agricultural exceptionalism, which means that they are excluded from many labor laws that protect all other workers. Under the Fair Labor Standards and the National Labor Relations Act, they're excluded from most of the protections that protect other workers. And a little bit about farm workers. Many farm workers in this country today are actually transplanted from their home countries. They could have left their countries because of violence, in political reasons, natural disasters, and we're having increasing migration because of climate change, natural disasters from other countries. They're also victims of our immigration system, our agricultural system, which we just talked about, and international trade agreements impacting their home countries. There's an excellent book called Eating NAFTA, and it talks about how NAFTA and other trade policies affected the social strata in Mexico and how it caused a lot of migration to this country. So it's really important to understand the full scope of the push and pull factors that cause farm workers or people to leave their home countries to come into this country to work as farm workers. Next slide, thank you. So not only do farm workers harvest the food that feed the rest of us, but farm work is considered one of the top hazardous occupations in the entire United States. In addition to just really dangerous conditions like standing on ladders harvesting oranges or being threatened by farm equipment, which causes serious accidents, farm workers are also exposed to pesticides in the workplace, which can have both short-term and long-term chronic health consequences. And increasingly, they're exposed to heat stress, which is getting worse with climate change. Next slide. Thank you. And so there are approximately 900 million pounds of pesticides applied to crops in the United States each year. One of the things that our organization works on is trying to change pesticide policy, because we have seen too often the health effects of farm workers, everything from rashes, headaches, nausea, vomiting, dizziness in the workplace, to long-term health effects such as autoimmune disease, cancer, reproductive health problems, spontaneous abortion, and many other things. So it's heartbreaking to see the consequences of people who are some of the most vulnerable, who do not have access to health care or health insurance, suffering from these health consequences of pesticide exposure just in order to make a living for themselves and to feed the rest of us. And they're also exposed to heat, as we mentioned before. Farm workers experience or die of heat stroke at a rate 20 times that. Die of heat stroke from 20 times that of the regular population, and 39 times that from pesticide exposure than all other industries. And you can see this gentleman in the picture wearing a full suit to apply pesticides. Oftentimes farm workers are sent out to apply pesticides and they are not given proper PPE and are not trained in how to protect themselves. One of the things that our organization does is to try and train farm workers about washing their hands, covering their bodies, separating their work clothes from their family laundry when they do laundry because their clothes have pesticides on them, how to protect their children from pesticides. So if farm workers are not given these trainings or this information, then they often risk exposure themselves and it affects the next generation. Farm worker children have autism and learning disabilities at an increased rate from children in other occupations. Next slide.
So the people who spend their days picking fruits and vegetables literally struggle to feed themselves and their own families. Numerous studies across the US have documented the staggering rates of hunger and food security that plague farm worker communities. One study of farm workers in Georgia found that 63% of migrant and seasonal workers that were surveyed struggled to feed themselves and their families, 63%. Farm workers often face countless barriers when trying to get food, including low wages, poor or non-existent public transportation, and the lack of culturally appropriate food. So where do farm workers get their food? In a 2017 study, researchers met with 200 migrant farm workers in North Carolina camps to better understand the transportation barriers and how it affects their access to food. Some of their findings are on this slide. 91% obtained most of their food from superstores like Walmart, and the remaining 9% said they shopped at local supermarkets like Food Lion. 87% said that they relied on someone else to drive them to the store or not. You can see that transportation is a huge barrier for farm worker access to food, and the locations they go don't necessarily provide a wide variety of culturally appropriate food. So let's look at food security. The basic definition of food security, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, is access by all people at all times to enough food for an active, healthy life. Food insecurity is simply the opposite. So let's look a little bit deeper at food justice and consider food sovereignty. Jeannie?
Yes, so the Farm Worker Association and National Farm Worker Ministry groups around the country have been fighting for justice for farm workers for decades. 50, 60, 70 years, we've been fighting for better wages, better living conditions, against exposure to pesticides, better workplace conditions. And yet here we are in 2022, and farm workers are still suffering from all kinds of discrimination, workplace abuses, and terrible working conditions and terrible laws that don't, and regulations that don't sufficiently protect them. So one of the things that the Farm Worker Association has done and has determined is that it's really much deeper than just getting policy change here or getting a win here. Even though all those things are important, a union contract is important, policy change is important, but fundamentally, it's our basic agricultural system that at its root is racist and has, it's capitalist, and it's based on the colonialist model. And if we don't change systems, and if we don't get to the root of the problem, then we're going to continue to be fighting these little battles over and over again. So while of course we want farm workers to have food security, everyone should have the right to enough food, adequate food, healthy food all the time. But going beyond that, we believe that farm workers should have the right, not just farm workers, all people, but farm workers in particular should have the right to decide what food they eat, to have control of their own food system. So we believe in food sovereignty, which actually works to give people access to land and access to the ability to grow their own food in their own ethnic and sustainable ways. And it's about building community while you're growing food. So we believe in farm workers having access to land and being able to control the seeds that they grow and the, and what they produce, and being able to do it in an ethnic way. So it's not quite land reparations, but giving access to land is important for farm workers to have food sovereignty. Next slide. So the Farm Worker Association is a member of La Via Campesina, and that is an international peasants movement that is fighting for food sovereignty around the world. And according to them, food sovereignty is the liberty and the capacity to produce and consume culturally significant food that was produced justly and without toxic chemicals. It's also about people and communities having power over their own food systems that can and should include access to land and even the idea of land reparations. Just one more little note about food sovereignty. We have abundance in our grocery stores. We go to the grocery store and we can pick tomatoes and oranges and bring them home, lettuces and bring them home for our own consumption. but we really don't have food sovereignty ourselves, because what we go to the grocery store and buy is determined by the agricultural system that decides what plants and what crops they're going to produce and what they're going to sell to the consumer. So food sovereignty really is an issue for all of us, but it starts with farm workers.
Wow, thanks, Jeannie. So how can we help farm workers? We want to take a few minutes to look at some specific things. We won't have time to go in deep for everything. And so we're hoping that there'll be some questions a little bit later where we can delve into some of the things that you want to know about. But we can support farm worker unions and organizations. The National Farmworker Ministry seeks to support all the farm worker organizing groups that are farm worker led or elected around the country. Farm Worker Association, as well as the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, the United Farm Workers, the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, Migrant Justice, Alianza de Nacional de Campesinas, and a number of other farm worker organizations. We try to give support to each of this. Each of them functions in their own way. They organize a little bit differently, and we seek to reach out to each of them. And we invite our supporters, many of you who are on the call tonight, to be involved in whatever efforts that they are attempting in their own communities and across the U.S. Farm workers deserve the same protections as all other workers. And this is a fundamental principle for us, and they deserve the right to organize without retaliation. This is one of the basic rights that they deserve, that we continue to battle for through legislation, through public awareness, and in every way that we can. We specifically support food certification programs. The National Farm Worker Ministry currently partners with 4 food certification programs. 3 of them have food labels that you can look for. If you don't see them in your community, you can ask the store manager, and we'll show you the labels in just a second. Each organization is independent of National Farm Worker Ministry and of each other, but all serve a similar purpose: to bring together growers, farm workers, packers, distributors, retailers, and consumers to transform agriculture at various levels and improve the lives and working conditions of farm workers. Jeannie, do you want to say a little bit about the Agricultural Food Justice Project?
Yes, so the Farm Worker Association is a member of the AJP, or the Agricultural Justice Project, and it began in the mid-1990s in a very long process that built the standards that really involved all sectors of the food chain, but it was a concerted effort to make sure that farm workers were part of building the program for AJP. There were multiple meetings, getting input, and meetings with farm workers to find out from them what it meant to have a just food system. Today, the Agricultural Justice Project is probably the smallest of the food certification programs, but it does have an audit that audits farms that get the AJP certification. And the one thing that distinguishes it from other food certification programs is that it excludes the use of any kind of pesticides or chemical fertilizers. So that's one of the reasons that we really support the AJP. And there's one farm in Florida that's AJP certified. Most of the farms are in California and the Midwest and in Canada. And you're welcome to go to the website and learn a lot more about the AJP.
You can learn a little bit more about each of these food certification programs at the National Farm Worker Ministry website. Look under Take Action. The next one we wanted to talk about was the Equitable Food Initiative. It focuses on worker involvement and active collaboration among all the stakeholders, major food buyers like Costco, growers, farm worker groups, and consumer advocates. Currently, several of the farm worker unions have representation on the board of directors. And so have been part of helping to shape this program and continuing to shape its growth and operations in the U.S. The Equitable Food Initiative currently has most of its produce on the West Coast, but we're hoping that it will expand through the network and come across the country. Another food certification program that I'm sure many of you have heard about is the Fair Food Program. This comes from the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. It is a worker-driven, socially responsible model, has a code of conduct and an agreement made with farms and with companies to pay a penny a pound more for tomatoes and other produce that goes directly to farm workers and improves their wages. They have an 800 number for grievances. They do one of the most extensive surveys of farms who are part of the program to ensure that they're continuing to be in compliance. And they have an incredible program of addressing grievances in the fields. Patterned after the Fair Food Program, and this is the one program that doesn't have a labeling of their product, but it's Milk with Dignity. Migrant Justice, based in Vermont, is responsible for the Milk with Dignity program. They also have a code of conduct and a worker-driven, socially responsible model of monitoring things. They work in the dairy field. They're primarily in the Northeast. So we want to take a few minutes to talk about just models of self-directed food justice programs. There are food cooperatives. Many of you are familiar with those efforts, community-supported agriculture. Those we won't talk extensively about tonight. We want to take a minute to talk about community gardens and ask Jeannie if she'll address that.
Yes, so thank you. As I mentioned earlier about food sovereignty, part of our practice of food sovereignty is also adopting the principles and the philosophy and the cosmology, I guess you would say, of agroecology. You might have been hearing about agroecology. It's become a little bit more trendy. We're a little bit concerned about that because we don't want it to be co-opted. But agroecology, the way we practice it and in its purest form, is really a very, very deep concept. It is more than just it's beyond sustainable, it's beyond organic, it's even beyond regenerative agriculture, because it includes in its principles bringing people together and engaging people in outreach to their other community members. It is bringing their cultural history, cultural growing practices, their ethnic knowledge and ancestral knowledge to the community to work together to grow food in a harmonious way, but to also save seeds and pass that on to the next generation. In the picture here on the right-hand side, you'll see our community garden in Fellsmere, which is our office that is on the East Coast. We have 5 offices in the state. And you can see that it's multi-ethnic. We have African-American, Haitian, and Hispanic members of the community garden on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, you'll see our community garden in the Popka. That's our newest community garden. And the importance there is that the grassroots communities themselves are the decision makers. It's not top down, it's grassroots, and it's bottom up. So we believe that these community gardens are a really important place to, and this is the next slide, to pass on to the next generation. That sign that the young children are carrying says, "Vamos a nuestros raíces." It means we are going to our roots, so we're returning to our roots. Again, this is our community garden in the Popka, and you can see the plants that they're growing there. And it's about bringing in the generations, and so that the older generation can pass on knowledge and wisdom, but also build community with each other, multi-ethnic and multi-generationally. Next slide.
So another way to support farm workers is through their campaigns and through legislation. For National Farm Worker Ministry, we have been working to show up for farm workers with the United Farm Workers Union on state legislation to achieve farm worker voting rights. We've also been working with the Farm Labor Organizing Committee on seeking tobacco farm workers' rights through tobacco corporations operating in North Carolina. And we have been supporting Migrant Justice of Vermont to expand their Milk with Dignity program to include Hannaford supermarkets. They already have an agreement with Ben & Jerry's, but that's only about 20% of the dairy industry in Vermont. So they're now focusing on Hannaford to increase the number of dairy workers that they can represent. We also have been supporting a boycott of Wendy's with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. Those of you who are familiar with the coalition know that, that a number of years ago, they recognized that tomatoes that were grown in Immokalee were sold through the major fast food companies in this country. And so they had a boycott initially with Taco Bell, and Taco Bell signed their agreement. And then they did not boycott, but they moved to McDonald's. McDonald's signed their agreement. They moved to Burger King. Burger King signed their agreement. They've been moving through the major fast food companies, and Wendy's is the last holdout who has refused to sign the Fair Food Agreement. So the coalition is continuing to work with them to encourage them to take on this human rights-based code of conduct. And this Saturday, April the 2nd, the coalition is sponsoring a march in Palm Beach, Florida, to draw attention to the boycott. And they're in Palm Beach, Florida, because the chairman of the board of Wendy's, that's where his residence is. So they're bringing attention right to the back door of the leaders of that company. So if you're in Florida and you can help us out, please show up for the march next week. We have information about that on our website. So Jeannie's going to talk a little bit about some of the legislation that we've been working on. There may not be legislative numbers to this, but you can see legislation that has been proposed or will be proposed that we've sought to work on along with them over different amounts of time.
Thank you. As I mentioned before, our organization does work on food sovereignty and agroecology, but we also recognize the importance of policy. There are policies that affect so many farm workers and low-income minority rural communities in our areas in Florida and around the country that we recognize the importance of trying to work on policy that improves the lives of farm workers while we're working on the bigger structural challenges at the same time. And one thing is food stamps. Now, a lot of farm workers are undocumented, and as undocumented workers, they're not eligible for food stamps. But if they have US born children, they can get food stamps for their children. At our office, we do help farm workers fill out food stamp applications, but there have been efforts, as you know, to roll back food stamps, to cut funding to food stamps, and the food stamp, it's in the Farm Bill. So one thing that we do every 4 years is we work on Farm Bill policy, especially as relates to trying to support and advocate for expansion of the food stamp program. So that really, and we see it every day in our office, how much that matters to people in our community, that they have access to food stamps for their children. The other one is for minority and women ranchers and farmers. So one of the things that the founder of our organization used to say, Tirso Moreno co-founded the Farm Worker Association, and he used to say, farm workers are just landless farmers. And I think that's very profound, because many farm workers that come from Guatemala, El Salvador, Mexico, Haiti, and even African-American farm workers that have been here generationally since the days of slavery actually know farming. They did farming. They just didn't have access to land and capital to be able to be farmers or ranchers. And they because of discriminatory policies, they didn't have access to the things that would enable them to be the farm or ranch owners. So there are bills, or there are provisions within the Farm Bill to assist with minority and women ranchers and farmers. And so that's another thing, another area that we advocate for in the Farm Bill, is for increased funding for minority and women ranchers and farmers. There's also a place in the Farm Bill for young farmers and ranchers. And again, that's another thing that we support and advocate for, because you've probably heard in the news that there is an increasing amount of attrition, I guess you'd say, of farmers in this country. I think the average age of farmers in this country is like in the late 50s or early 60s, which means that family farms are becoming, very sadly, a thing of the past. And that means that agribusiness gets more and more control of farmland. So why do we care about farmers and ranchers? Because we know that big agribusiness makes life and policies that are worse for farm workers. And by supporting young farmers, we hope to revive the small farms in this country, and also make a pathway so that minority communities and farmers can become farmers themselves. The Climate Stewardship Act. So if you're doing work with farm workers, you have to recognize the impacts of climate change. And if we're not addressing climate change in every aspect of our work, we're missing the boat. We have just hired a climate justice organizer at the Farmworker Association, and we recognize that we need to be engaged in climate policy, because there's lots of bad climate policy out there that a lot of big corporate businesses are promoting to greenwash their practices. And so we support the Climate Stewardship Act, because within the Climate Stewardship Act, there is provisions for social justice. Unlike the Growing Climate Solutions Act, which we don't support, which unfortunately did pass the House. But we are not happy with that, because it really benefits big agribusiness. We also support the Agricultural Resilience Act, because that promotes kind of a regenerative agriculture frame. And what I didn't say before about agroecology is that agroecology is more than just not putting chemicals into the soil. It's actually about using practices that actually build soil and make soil and restore the soil. So regenerative agriculture, agroecology, those are more incorporated into the Agricultural Resilience Act. Next slide.
Well, one of the things I want to add just before we move, Jeannie, is in addition to this, and I think both our groups have supported the Fairness for Farmers, Farm Workers Act, which would provide overtime pay for all farm workers. Currently, that's not a guarantee, only in some of the states in this country. And the challenge of it is it has languished in committee. It was introduced without bipartisan support, as you might imagine. And so it's been reintroduced, but it's never really gotten out of committee. But we support overtime pay for all the farm workers in this country.
Absolutely, yes. Yes, so thank you. So there's a few other bills here that you can look at, and these are things that we are actively supporting right now. And the one is the Asunción Valdivia Heat Illness and Fatality Prevention Act. Before the current state of affairs in Congress, this bill was getting some attention and was moving along, but things have kind of stalled right now. But it would work with Osha to ensure that there are standards and regulations to protect farm workers from heat stress. Believe it or not, there are no regulations to protect workers at all from heat stress. And that is an Osha process, and I'm happy to talk about that at length, but I won't stay on it now. But that's a really important bill for farm workers, because as you know, last summer, it was really devastating for so many people around the country, and especially farm workers. The Protect America's Children from Toxic Pesticides Act is great. It would basically reform FIFRA, which is the pesticide law under EPA. It would ban organophosphate pesticides, neonicotinoid pesticides, and many others. And this is something that we think is like the gold standard. It would allow some pesticides, but it's really, really important. And we're afraid that it's going to stall in Congress, but we are really promoting it. And again, take a look at it and you can see just all the good aspects for that bill. Happy to talk about that some more too. The Justice for Black Farmers Act, really, really important. Again, we kind of talked about this earlier, but there needs to be a space for minority farmers, and especially Black farmers. I know people in our community who are Black and who are farm workers and whose land was taken from them. And this is unjust. So we need to restore access for Black farmers. There's a really good book called Freedom Farmers. I'll put it in the chat. Everybody should read it. It's excellent. Then there's the Environmental Justice for All Act. Senator Cory Booker was one of the sponsors of that act. And that basically includes environmental justice for all groups, but we were part of involved in that to make sure that farm workers are included. So yeah, next slide. And happy to talk more about any of these if you'd like.
Right. So for both of our organizations, we are supporting comprehensive immigration reform, and comprehensive immigration reform must provide a pathway to citizenship or immigration status for the nearly 1.5 million farm workers currently undocumented, along with their families. We have to have immigration reform to end the fear that keeps farm workers from challenging and unfair and abusive labor practices and makes them such a target for exploitation. I don't know if you want to say more about that, Jeannie?
Yes, I had a call a couple of weeks ago with people on the Senate Ag Committee that were interested in learning more about farm workers. And they asked questions about what conditions were like for farm workers and what kinds of things can help make things better for farm workers. So we talked about sexual harassment in the workplace. We talked about pesticide exposure and heat exposure and, working conditions and accidents and the agricultural exceptionalism. But basically, I said, if you're not addressing immigration reform, then you're missing the boat, because everything related to farm workers is related to immigration reform. Because when farm workers are afraid to speak out because of immigration policies or their undocumented status, then it's extremely hard to get any kind of changes in the workplace, and it makes them totally subject to abuse and exploitation. Just an example, as I mentioned before, I'm the pesticide safety person for the Farm Worker Association. Under the Trump administration, so our organization has been taking a thing called diagnosticos for over 30 years. And that is taking complaints from farm workers when there are violations in the workplace, such as, lack of field sanitation or lack of posting when pesticides are applied. During the Trump administration, we got almost no complaints from farm workers about workplace conditions. People were so afraid because of the anti-immigrant rhetoric, the anti-immigrant sentiment, the ugly ways that their children were treated in school, the way they were treated in public. Farm workers were so afraid of immigration, separation of families, that almost nobody reported workplace conditions that they had been doing for 20, 30, 40 years. So without immigration reform, we are hurting not only all of our country, but we're really hurting farm workers. One last comment about that is, because we don't have comprehensive immigration reform, we're seeing an influx of H-2A guest workers. And that's a long issue just in itself. But what happens with H-2A workers is that they displace workers that have been in this country for 10, 15, 20, even 30 and 40 years that may still be undocumented, that are working in agriculture, and they get displaced because H-2A workers come in, and then they are left in this underground economy where they're even more vulnerable than they were as farm workers. And it's really horrible for families and for our country. So comprehensive immigration reform, while it isn't a specific workplace issue, it's crucial to getting justice for farm workers.
Thanks, Jeannie. So farm workers are the hands that connect the fruits and vegetables of the earth to the tables where we nourish ourselves. They're the closest to the ground. What happens in the fields happens to them. Farm workers feed us. So we want to take a few minutes to see if you have questions, if you want to go a little bit deeper on some of the things that we mentioned. It's hard to say everything you want to say. Jeannie and I talked about this before. We want to tell you everything, and it's not possible. So we tried to hit some highlights tonight for a broad audience. And so we want to be able to take some questions. I know some of you have been putting those in the chat, and so Rose will help us navigate that. But let's see if we have some questions from folks tonight.
We do have some questions. The first one is, do the farm workers have access to community gardens? And how can farm workers acquire suitable land in their local areas for community gardens if they don't maybe already have access to one?
Jeannie, you want to take that?
Sure. So I think the places that farm workers have community gardens are where there is the farm worker grassroots organization. So for example, yes, the Farm Worker Association has community gardens, and we were one of the first to start that. But CATA in New Jersey, or the Farm Workers Support Committee, has started community gardens. C2C, or community to community, on the West Coast in Oregon and Washington, they have a community farm that they started. And other organizations around the country have started community gardens as well. I think it's a little difficult for farm workers to get access to land if they don't have an advocacy and grassroots organization to work with, but it doesn't mean that they can't. Sometimes they can do it through their church. Now, access to land is difficult, and if they're undocumented, they probably don't have the same rights. So going through an organization or a church or some kind of an institution or agency that they can work with would definitely make it easier. We had a hard time getting land, but that's a long story in itself. I can talk about that if you want. And we're having a hard time keeping some of the land that we already have. But the gardens that we have were really started by the grassroots. It wasn't like the Farm Worker Association said, oh, we should have a community garden. The community told us, or the community said themselves that they wanted to start a community garden. So it's possible, but again, it helps if there is some kind of an organization for them to work with and through to get that access. I hope that answers that. I'm happy to expound more on it if necessary.
We do have a few more other questions. One kind of circles back to that here in just a moment, but someone wants to see if you can share a little more about OSHA and heat illness regulations, maybe what some recommendations would be regarding those OSHA regulations.
So I'm gonna let Jeannie answer that, but I'm gonna say that the National Farm Worker Ministry was invited by the Farm Worker Association, by Jeannie specifically, and by some of our other farm worker partners to submit comments recently as OSHA considers heat stress regulations. We ended up polling some of our farm worker partners to say, what are the things that you want us to highlight? Because it's important for us to have a voice in this as well. Because we're stakeholders. What happens to farm workers is vital to us, not just as advocates, but as human beings who eat on this planet. But so there's a place on our website that you can go and look at the specific things that we pointed out. We took some suggestions from Farm Worker Association and from the Farm Worker Union Pecun that's in Oregon, and a couple other places, so that we would be on point and in solidarity with them. But Jeannie, you might want to speak to that more specifically, even. This is one of your areas. So.
Sure. So OSHA has heat stress recommendations right now. They're only recommendations, and those recommendations are for water, rest, and shade, which is fine as far as it goes. But it gets more complicated than that, and we submitted extensive comments to EPA, to OSHA about the heat stress. Basically, we did interviews with several farm workers to ask them what they felt was important. So access to water is important, of course, but we had farm workers tell us that one place would have the big containers of water that, like you have in the offices, and the service would come once a week. And in the summertime, that water would run out in, halfway through the week, and the service wouldn't come, for another 3 or 4 days. And so there wasn't water there. So it's much more complicated than that. Yes, water, rest, and shade. Then you have to get into the details. And California has some details about, at what temperature workers need to stop and have breaks every 10 or 15 minutes, or every hour for 15 minutes. I think it needs to be very specified by area. So for example, in Florida, we have high humidity. And so just the temperature alone isn't sufficient. You have to have temperature plus humidity to look at the heat index. In California, you need to think about, the fires. And so what the conditions are in those cases. So I think it's really important that OSHA not just to make real generalized standards, but that they get a lot more specific, and especially for farm workers, because conditions are so different for farm workers. So I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but it's very complicated. And so it needs to be, and look at different kinds of crops. Farm workers that work in nurseries are experiencing a completely different kind of a situation than farm workers that work out in the sun harvesting tomatoes, or those that work in citrus where they're surrounded by trees. Real quick, one example. We've had farm workers tell us that when they're harvesting tropical fruits in a tree or in an orange grove, that because they are surrounded by, their head is in the trees, there's no air circulation. So they feel like they're suffocating. And then they get dizzy and feel like they're going to fall. If it's hot, then they feel like they're going to fall off the ladder. So these are all the things that OSHA needs to take into consideration. So it's not an easy thing. And so we need to really look at it comprehensively.
Well, and here in North Carolina, one of the primary crops is tobacco. And so trying to protect yourself from nicotine exposure in the tobacco fields, add the heat. And so it's a battle. Do I wear something that protects me from the nicotine, or do I take the weight of a long sleeve shirt off so that I can get a little bit of cool and that kind of thing? So it's different in different places, and it's different with different crops. It's a big challenge.
Actually, if I can jump in 1 minute, I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the big issues right now is the intersection of heat and pesticide exposure. So that's one of the things that the Farm Worker Association is really concerned about. The Union of Concerned Scientists did a report about 3 or 4 years ago called Farm Workers at Risk, looking at pesticide and heat exposure and how one exacerbates the other. So for example, we've been fighting with EPA over several different pesticides like atrazine and aldicarb and paraquat, really bad pesticides, and EPA is saying, oh, well, the farm workers can just wear more personal protective equipment. Well, that makes them hotter. And then they're exposed to other kinds of issues like dizziness or falling from trees if they have to put on more PPE. And we even had one report say that it was economically beneficial to the growers for the farm workers to wear more PPE so that they can work and get more crops done, use the pesticides and get more crop harvested. So it's very complicated, but it's really important to understand the intersection of heat and pesticide exposure.
So the next question is about pesticides. Sierra Club sent something out today about EPA about to recertify several nicotinoid pesticides. Can you, either one of you speak to that?
Jeannie, definitely.
Yes, so it's neonicotinoid pesticides. You got me on my subject, so you're gonna have to get the reins and pull me in. So neonicotinoids are kind of the newer class of pesticides since organochlorines were banned, and organophosphates are being maligned as being really bad. But we're finding out how bad neonicotinoids are. They're also implicated in pollinator collapse, bee colony collapse, and other things. They're not as much as known about the neonicotinoids, although there's increasing scientific studies on that. We're fighting with EPA right now over registration of the organophosphates. And because of that, we haven't focused a whole lot on neonicotinoids. There's another group called the Pollinator Protection Network that's focusing a lot on the neonicotinoids. Basically, our position as an organization is that we need to stop all these pesticides completely. We understand it's not going to happen tomorrow. They all need to be phased out generally, because another thing, and again, you got me on my subject here, what people don't know is that, a lot of people don't know, is that pesticides also deplete the soil and make the soil less able to sequester carbon. That's another reason why we believe in agroecology, because agroecologically maintained soils sequester carbon better. They also have more nutrients in them, so your food gets more nutrients. And agroecology and regenerative agriculture actually can help mitigate the effects of climate change. So neonicotinoids, I don't know which specific ones were being re-registered by EPA, but we've been fighting with EPA over many things, and we're also fighting with EPA over the influence of agribusiness, basically agrochemical companies' influence on EPA. Sharon Lerner has done a series of articles on that I can talk about more, but I will stop there. Thanks.
And then the last question in the chat: are there any particular programs that provide creative opportunities, perhaps through privately owned family farms or city or county-based programs, or even through congregation-owned lands for affordable leasing of small acreage for self-production of crops for farm workers so they can feed their own families or communities with their chosen food?
Oh,
Wow.
I'll jump in again.
Go ahead.
A lot of groups are going to co-ops, and we have tried. A co-op is very difficult. You have to really. It takes a lot of work to form and to maintain a co-op, and because farm workers and rural communities are low income, if a co-op isn't generating income, in a fairly short period of time, it's hard for people to maintain that. So we did try a couple of times to start co-ops, and unfortunately they didn't last really long. But it doesn't mean that the model isn't a good model, but there are other places like Co-op Jackson in Mississippi is not a farm worker group, but they are an urban group that has started a co-op that's been maintained for a long time. Again, community to community in Oregon and Washington have a co-ops, and again, we're hoping that at some point in the future, we can start again to do a co-op model, but it is very labor intensive. So that is one way. And usually if there's a co-op, sometimes you can get a city or a municipality or somebody to give access to land to help you start the co-op. If I do want to get one thing in before we close, again, we're getting close to time. You were talking about pesticides. I just want to let people know that it's really, really horrible, but EPA approved the use of streptomycin, which is an antibiotic, to be used as a pesticide on citrus crops in Florida. We're part of a lawsuit against EPA against this practice. And happy to talk more about that too, but it's really horrible that they've done, and they're already using tetracycline, which is an antibiotic, as a pesticide.
So just to piggyback on what you were talking about before you went to back to the pesticides, just to say that I think the farm worker organizing groups around the country are some of the best groups that you can partner with if you happen to be a local congregation, if you're in an area where one of those exists. And we've got an interactive map on our on our website, so you can sort of see the locations of some of these groups. But I would go to them with the idea, not with lots of like that they'll know exactly how to put that in place. But I would go to them first just to broker the idea and to approach that and begin to build relationships so that together you could make something like that happen. You could donate land, you could provide a shared partnership in having a congregation or church or community group or whatever, just partner with them on planting together, working together, securing land, or any of those kinds of things. And also, if you have heritage land, if you have land that was traditionally, for example, a vineyard or an orchard, and you don't intend, well, you could do pecans or nuts or whatever, but and you don't want to continue in that operation, you can connect with groups that are working with farm workers. Jeannie made that point earlier for us, that they're really, in a lot of senses, displaced farmers from another place, but to approach them about the possibility of their taking over that particular land and that particular vineyard or orchard and bringing it back. We've seen some of that happen in small spaces, but in different parts of the country. So thank you for the questions. Jeannie, thank you for being a part of this with us tonight. We're so glad to be partnering together. I would just wondered if you might have some final thoughts that you want to leave with the folks that have joined us tonight.
Sure. So one of the things that we are a grassroots organization, and one thing that sometimes we struggle with is groups that want to help farm workers come in and say, oh, we can do this, or we can do that, or let us help you do this. It's really important to understand that farm workers don't need or want charity. They want to be lifted up. Of course, yes, sometimes they need food. Yes, sometimes they need clothes. Sometimes they need housing. But the reality is that what we need to do is lift up farm workers. So if you want to help farm workers, what you need to do is to listen to them, to be in relationship with farm workers, to center and uplift and prioritize their views and not impose things on them. Let them make decisions for themselves. Don't make decisions for them and come in and say, oh, well, we think you need a co-op, so we're going to do this, or we think you need a community garden, so we're going to do this. It should be bottom up and not top down. The same thing, policy discussions and decisions should not be led by policymakers, academics, researchers, business leaders, etc. They should be made directly by the people who are affected. So if you want to work on policy change, come to farm workers and say, what works for you? What do you need? Respect the knowledge of Black and Hispanic and Indigenous people of colors communities. They have knowledge, they have experience, they have skill. Oftentimes farm work is called unskilled labor. Try it and see if you can do it. It's very skilled. I can't do it. I tried harvesting okra once. It was a disaster. So make sure that you understand that they have expertise and they want self-determination. And only then can there be real, true social, environmental, climate, health, and worker justice. Thank you. And thank you for this opportunity to talk with everyone today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeannie. And the last word from the National Farm Worker Ministry: treat farm workers with the dignity and respect they and their work deserve. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, for being part of Farm Worker Awareness Week and sharing together with us in this. Please go to our websites to find out more. Join us in the different efforts that we have. Farm Worker Association there in Florida, National Farm Worker Ministry supporting Farm Worker Association of Florida, and all the other farm worker groups around the country. If you can march next Saturday, please do. If you're in California, tomorrow's Thursday is a day for you to show up in different parts of California to stand with farm workers. Join us. We appreciate you, and thanks so much for joining us tonight.